Here is something I think you'll find interesting, a few resources. The Diary of Christopher Columbus, First Voyage to America, as you see. And it's written in both English and Spanish, as he wrote it himself, with English translation on the contrary page. But you know the story that's, well, when I was growing up, the story we always heard was, what was it? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And, you know, he was built up to be this great hero and so on. But they don't tell the rest of the story, which is he ended up in disgrace, being stripped of his titles, sent back to Spain, and put in jail for his cruelty to the native people. And this was in a pretty cruel age and era. Bartolome de las Casas, as you see here, was someone who started documenting the cruelty that was going on with Columbus. His own family wouldn't speak to him, and he died impoverished in jail. And you know, that's the story you never hear. You don't hear that part about him. However, in this book, which is worth reading if you can stomach it, I think there's hardly a page where he doesn't talk about his desire to find gold and riches. There might be one or two where he skips out, he misses a day, but almost the whole thing is about that. And you don't have to read far before you think, wow, this guy is obsessed with becoming rich and famous. And he did for a short while. But again, it's worth a read. And everything we read, we'll take it as a learning tool. It doesn't mean that you like it. It just means you can learn something from it. And I had wanted to for a place to put this book down. There we go. Talk a little bit about the King Philip's War. This is a book by Clara Endicott Sears, The Great Powwow, which was probably one of the earliest, I think, well-written and sympathetic towards First Nations people stories of the King Philip's War. If you're familiar with Fruitland's museums, that was her house which she donated to. She left her in her will for it to become a museum, and that there would be a Native, it's a series of museums, and a Native American museum is one of those. So it's a collection. There's an art gallery. There's a Shaker house that was moved from the Shaker village nearby. That's a museum. The Native American Museum. It's really well worth a visit. And there are trails and walks and things like that. And they have rotating galleries and exhibits and so on. But that's, again, if you can find it, it's a great powwow, certainly well worth the read. There's an article online called The King Philip's War, the greatest, or the most important war you've never heard of. And if you would just Google that, that will come up. King Philip's War. That in itself should bring you a lot of different links. King Philip's War, the most important war you've never heard of. And a lot of people haven't heard of it. There's a little fascinating story, I think, and that's why I brought out my war club here to show you, not for my propensity for war, but rather just as a kind of a curiosity in a story, so you know what I'm talking about. So warriors would have carried, not just warriors too, people would have carried these for their protection. That's all solidly carved. It's from one solid piece of wood that's not fixed in there, so it's a snake if you can see it. See the design as the snake there, with the eyes up there. King Philip was killed, Metacom, and he's recorded as having a few different names, all variations, and those were the English that were doing that, not he himself. Metacomecticut, Metacomet. He was given the name of Philip by the English. His father was Massasoit, the one who had met the first, what are now called pilgrims. They never used that name for themselves. They would have called themselves, as they did, saints. Saints and strangers. You were a stranger if you weren't a saint. And they did not get along with the Puritans at all. They were not friends, and they had quite different ways of thinking for a long time. And they're often confused with them or confounded with them. Or sometimes people use those two words in exchange. The Pilgrims. They also were called separatists in their day, and they would have been familiar with that term. Pilgrims doesn't come along till the 19th century. Anyway, things quickly began to fall apart as more Puritans were arriving in Boston, rapidly falling apart. And the Pilgrims, the separatists, the people we now know as Pilgrims, had tried to make peace with the local Wampanoag people. And at first they were fairly successful. You know, when I hear people talking about, oh, I'm not celebrating Thanksgiving, all people who had agriculture had celebration harvests, and so did the Wampanoag. That was also part of their culture. And 90 of them were invited. They stayed there for 3 days and they played games, they went hunting. They brought, I think it was 5 deer with them to help feed people. But I don't have a problem with that at all. I think it's nice to keep that custom. There are a number of Thanksgivings, right? Some people will say there was one for every full moon. Well, that's partly true, but it wasn't like the harvest festival. So after Massasoit dies, his son, Metacom, is not happy with what's been happening. And Massasoit wasn't either near the end. He saw what was going on with his lands, that people were just coming and taking it and not asking him anything or making any kind of a recompense for it. So what he does, finally, Metacom that is, they hold some councils, and that's what the title of this book is talking about this, the Great Powwow, and they called different nations to a big meeting that lasted several days to talk about what to do with this situation, because Metacom said, it is not my intent to sit idly by until I have no kingdom, no land. And he was called King Philip. People in those days, some days today, people say, and this is part of the colonization process, even native people say this, we never had titles. Yeah, we did. We did have titles. And we had noble titles and royal titles. We had all of those. But part of the colonization process was just that, having a lot of people forget what we once had, forget that we had our hieroglyphics previous to Europeans coming. I think I'd mentioned previously, I was told once that we never had agriculture. These were by, well, self-proclaimed elders, or corn, or other things, beans, squash. I was told by someone, oh, the Mi'kmaq people never grew corn, beans, and squash. That was people further west. You know, you don't want to argue, but then it makes you kind of sad that people don't know this. So these were widely circulated. The Pequot Fort at Mystic, it predated the King Philip's War. So the Pequot War was in the 1630s. And this is one representation of their fort, which was completely destroyed. This is an aerial view, I guess, of it, even though there were no airplanes. But people still had an idea, of course, of what it would have looked like looking down here. This is one, I mean, it's pure propaganda, of course. And these, well, when you look at it, what does it say to you? Here's this poor boy being attacked by a local First Nations person, and I guess it was supposed to be his father here, fighting off another one in the background. So these were propaganda, and they were put up in lots of places, public places, like on tavern doors, even church house doors. They were tacked up in stores. The idea was to raise sentiment and agitation, right, amongst settlers. And when you look at it, of course, you would sympathize with the boy and therefore settlers. But what they're forgetting and omitting entirely is this is the native people's land. And a lot of them didn't sign a treaty, and the few who did, people just kept taking and taking, or they would just add on and change treaties and just claim more land for themselves. So another one here, which is supposed to, I guess, rise anger, is a bunch of native people, a group of native people attacking an English village. And finally we have, again, an attack on a First Nations village. And I suppose this is supposed to make settlers feel good that this happened, right? That, oh yes, we're winning, we're doing something. And finally, after Philip is killed, the war starts in 1675, and it ends pretty quickly. It ends a year later, 1676. It goes on that's when there's an agreement signed. It goes on until 1678. So for a couple more years, 2 more years in northern New England, but not in the southern part. And what it did was really devastated the First Nations people. That's why today there are so few First Nations people there in that area of the country in New England. A few like in northern Maine and northern New York, but that's really a few, as I say. So this is King Philip's head being taken into Boston on a pike. It was put in a cage and it was hung up there for years and years. I don't know, as a victory and as a warning, I suppose, but there weren't many native people to warn by that time. So I brought out the War Club so that you know what I'm talking about when I mention it. This is a fascinating story, I think. There was a War Club. It was King Philip's War Club that was in the museum that Sarah Endicott Sears, the writer of this book, The Great Powwow, had collected and put in there. And there's a whole exhibit on the King Philip's War there if you ever go there to Fruitland's museums. And he didn't have a lot of, like, I don't know, guardrails or windows or things, and someone stole Henry David Thoreau's journals, his real journals there, because you could just go and take them, right? And someone stole King Philip's War Club. And of course they didn't have cameras then and so on, so no one really knew what to do. I think they just then started to put up glass windows and cords and things that you couldn't pass. Now they have cameras, but they didn't then. So there was a man at a yard sale in Worcester, Massachusetts, near the center of the state, more or less. And he found, he didn't know what it was, but he found this instrument here, like this, the War Club, and thought it looked interesting, so he bought it. And he had it for a while, and I don't know it wasn't much, a few dollars. I don't think the people selling it knew. And then someone said to him, I think you have something really important on your hands. And it took him a while, but he found people who knew, because there were drawings of it and so on. It was well known. And it turned out that was the same War Club, that King Philip's War Club, that had been stolen from the Fruitlands Museum. So it was returned to, isn't that incredible? It was returned to them, and that's where it is now, and now it's behind a glass window so no one can, and with a camera, so no one can repeat the offense. I wanted to do a little tribute to. So with that, though, New England really the native people there never recovered. It was also devastating for the colonists. Their economy was almost ruined completely, like in, I think, Connecticut and Rhode Island, both of those places. And there were more than 10 towns that were completely destroyed throughout that area, Massachusetts, New England, Connecticut. There were others that were attacked, but 10 that were completely. So there's a woman, Mary Rowlandson, and if you watch my maze video, the Mi'kmaq Maze, you may have heard me mention her. Her husband now is a minister for what we would call the Puritan Church, then who would later become the Congregationalists. But in those days, they were still Puritans. She was captured near Lancaster, Massachusetts, and marched around, brought with the nation. They were fleeing, so they were always on the move for their own lives. It's kind of interesting. She wrote her account in The Captivity